Part 2 of a series of unfortunate events, the Austere Academy. It's book 5. And this is part 2, so I'm reading chapters 3 and 4. Here's the picture for chapter 3. The expression making a mountain out of a molehill simply means making a big deal out of something that is actually a small deal, and it is easy to see how this expression came about. Molehills are simply mounds of earth serving as condominiums for moles, and they have never caused anyone any harm except for maybe a stubbed toe if you are walking through the wilderness without any shoes on. Mountains, however, are very large mounds of earth and are constantly causing problems. They are very tall, and when people try to climb them, they often fall off, or get lost and die of starvation. Sometimes two countries fight over who really owns a mountain, and thousands of people have to go to war and come home grumpy or wounded. And of course, mountains serve as homes to mountain goats and mountain lions who enjoy attacking helpless picnickers and eating sandwiches or children. So when someone is making a mountain out of a molehill, they are pretending that something is as horrible as a war or a ruined picnic, when it is really only as horrible as a stubbed toe. When the Baudelaire orphans reached the shack where they were going to live, however, they realized that Vice Principal Narrow hadn't been making a mountain out of a molehill at all when he said that the shack was a dismal place. If anything, he had been making a molehill out of a mountain. It was true that the shack was tiny and, as Nara had said, and made of tin. And it was true that there was no living room, no game room, and no lending library. It was true that there were 3 bales of hay instead of beds, and that there was absolutely no fresh fruit in sight. But Vice Principal Narrow had left out a few details in his description, and it was these details that made the shack even worse. The first detail the Baudelaires noticed was that the shack was infested with small crabs, each one about the size of a matchbox, scurrying around the wooden floor with their tiny claws snapping in the air. As the children walked across the shack to sit glumly on one of the bales of hay, they were disappointed to learn that the crabs were territorial, a word which here means unhappy to see small children in their living quarters. The crabs gathered around the children and began snapping their claws at them. Luckily, the crabs did not have very good aim, and luckily their claws were so small that they probably wouldn't hurt any more than a good strong pinch. But even if they were more or less harmless, they did not make for a good shack. When the children reached the bale of hay and sat down, tucking their legs up under them to avoid the snapping crabs, they looked up at the ceiling and saw another detail Narrow had neglected to mention. Some sort of fungus was growing on the ceiling, a fungus that was light, tan, and quite damp. Every few seconds, small drops of moisture would fall from the fungus with a plop, and the children had to duck to avoid getting light tan fungus juice on them. Like the small crabs, the plopping fungus did not appear to be very harmful, but also like the small crabs, the fungus made the shack even more uncomfortable than the vice principal had described it. And lastly, as the children sat on the bale of hay with their legs tucked beneath them and ducked to avoid fungus juice, they saw one more harmless but unpleasant detail of the shack that was worse than Narrow had led them to believe, and that was the color of the walls. Each tin wall was bright green with tiny pink hearts painted here and there as if the shack were an enormous tacky Valentine's Day card instead of a place to live, and the Baudelaires found that they would rather look at the bales of hay or the small crabs on the floor or even the light tan fungus on the ceiling than the ugly walls. Overall, the shack was too miserable to serve as a storage space for old banana peels, let alone as a home for 3 young people. And I confess that if I had been told that it was my home, I probably would have lain on the bales of hay and thrown a temper tantrum. But the Baudelaires had learned long ago that temper tantrums, however fun they may be to throw, rarely solve whatever problem is causing them. So after a long, miserable silence, the orphans tried to look at their situation in a more positive light. "This isn't such a nice room," Violet said finally, "but if I put my mind to it, I bet I can invent something that can keep these crabs away from us." "And I'm going to read up on this light tan fungus," Klaus said. "Maybe the dormitory library has information on how to stop it from dripping." "I've bossed her," Sunny said, which went something like, "I bet I can use my 4 sharp teeth to scrape this paint away and make the walls a bit less ugly." Claus gave his baby sister a little kiss on the top of her head. "At least we get to go to school," he pointed out. "I've missed being in a real classroom." "Me too," Violet agreed. "And at least we'll meet some people our own age. We've only had the company of adults for quite some time." "Wannock," Sunny said, which probably meant, "and learning secretarial skills is an exciting opportunity for me, although I should really be in a nursery school instead." "That's true," Claus said, "and who knows, maybe the advanced computer really can keep Count Olaf away, and that's the most important thing of all." "You're right," Violet said. "Any room that doesn't have Count Olaf in it is good enough for me." "Olo," Sunny said, which meant, even if it's ugly, damp, and filled with crabs. The children sighed and then sat quietly for a few moments. The shack was quiet, except for the snapping of tiny crab claws, the plop of the fungus, and the sighs of the Baudelaires as they looked at the ugly walls. Try as they might, the youngsters just couldn't make the shack into a molehill. No matter how much they thought of real classrooms, people their own age, or their exciting opportunity of secretarial skills, their new home seemed much, much worse than even the sorest of stubbed toes. "Well," Claus said after a while, "it feels like it's about lunchtime. Remember, if we're late, they take away our cups and glasses, so we should probably get a move on." "Those rules are ridiculous," Violet said, ducking to avoid the plop. "Lunchtime isn't a specific time, so you can't be late for it. It's just a word that means around lunch." "I know," Claus said, "and the part about Sunny being punished for going to the administrative building, but when she has to go there to be Nero's secretary is completely absurd." "Kale! Kelk," Sunny said, putting her little hand on her brother's knee. She meant something like, "Don't worry about it. I'm a baby, so I hardly ever use silverware. It doesn't matter that it'll be taken away from me." Ridiculous rules or not, the orphans did not want to be punished, so the 3 of them walked gingerly. The word gingerly here means avoiding territorial crabs. Across the shack and out onto the brown lawn. Gym class must have been over because all the running children were gone, and this only made the Baudelaires walk even more quickly to the cafeteria. Several years before this story took place, when Violet was 10 and Claus was 8, and Sunny was not even a fetus, the Baudelaire family went to a county fair in order to see a pig that their uncle Elwyn had entered in a contest. The pig contest turned out to be a bit dull, but in the neighboring tent there was another contest that the family found quite interesting. The biggest lasagna contest. The lasagna that won the blue ribbon had been baked by 11 nuns and was as big and soft as a large mattress, perhaps because they were at such an impressionable age. The phrase impressionable age here means 10 and 8 years old, respectively. Violet and Claus always remembered this lasagna, and they were sure they would never see another one anywhere near as big. Violet and Claus were wrong. When the Baudelaires entered the cafeteria, they found a lasagna waiting for them that was the size of a dance floor. It was sitting on top of an enormous trivet to keep it from burning the floor, and the person serving it was wearing a thick metal mask as protection, so that the children could only see their eyes peeking out from tiny eye holes. The some Baudelaires got into a long line of children and waited their turn for the metal-masked person to scoop lasagna onto ugly plastic trays and hand it wordlessly to the children. After receiving their lasagna, the orphans walked further down the line and helped themselves to green salad, which was waiting for them in a bowl the size of a pickup truck. Next to the salad was a mountain of garlic bread, and at the end of the line was another metal-masked person handing out silverware to the students who had not been inside the administrative building. The Baudelaires said thank you to the person, who gave them a slow, metallic nod in return. They took a long look around the crowded cafeteria. Hundreds of children had already received their lasagna and were sitting at long rectangular tables. The Baudelaires saw several other children who had undoubtedly been in the administrative building because they had no silverware. They saw several more students who had their hands tied behind their backs as punishment for being late to class, and they saw several students who had a sad look on their faces as they had been forced to buy somebody a bag of candy and watch them eat it, and the orphans guessed that these students had failed to show up to one of Nero's 6-hour concerts. But it was none of these punishments that made the Baudelaire orphans pause for so long. It was the fact that they did not know where to sit. Cafeterias can be confusing places because there are different rules for each one, and sometimes it is difficult to know where one should eat. Normally, the Baudelaires would simply eat with one of their friends, but their friends were far, far away from Proof Rock Preparatory School, and Violet, Claus, and Sunny gazed around the cafeteria full of strangers and thought they might never put down their ugly trays. Finally, they caught the eye of the girl they had seen on the lawn, who had called them such a strange name, and walked a few steps toward her. Now, you and I know that this loathsome little girl was Carmelita Spatz, but the Baudelaires had not been properly introduced to her, and so did not realize just how loathsome she was, although, as the orphans drew closer, she gave them an instant education. "Don't even think of eating around here, you cake sniffers," Carmelita Spatz cried, and several of her rude, filthy, violent friends nodded in agreement. "Nobody wants to have lunch with people who live in the orphan's shack." "I'm terribly sorry," Claus said, although he wasn't terribly sorry at all. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Carmelita, who had apparently never been to the administrative building, picked up her silverware and began to bang it on her tray in a rhythmic and irritating way. "Cake-sniffing orphans in the orphan's shack. Cake-sniffing orphans in the orphan's shack," she chanted, and to the Baudelaires' dismay, many other children joined right in. Like many other rude, violent, filthy people, Carmelita Spatz had a bunch of friends who were always happy to help her torment people, probably to avoid being tormented themselves. In a few seconds, it seemed like the entire cafeteria was banging their silverware and chanting, "Cake-sniffing orphans in the orphan shack." The three siblings stepped closer together, craning their necks to see if there was any possible place to which they could escape and eat their lunch in peace. "Oh, leave them alone, Carmelita," a voice cried over the chanting. The Baudelaires turned around and saw a boy with very dark hair and very wide eyes. He looked a little older than Claus and a little younger than Violet, and had a dark green notebook tucked into the pocket of his thick wool sweater. "You're the cake sniffer, and nobody in their right mind would want to eat with you anyway. Come on," the boy said, turning to the Baudelaires. "There's room at our table." "Thank you very much," Violet said in relief, and followed the boy to the table that had plenty of room. He sat down next to the girl, who looked absolutely identical to the boy. She looked about the same age and had very dark hair, very wide eyes, and a notebook tucked into the corner of her thick wool sweater. The only difference seemed to be that the girl's notebook was pitch black. Seeing two people who look so much alike is a bit eerie, but it's better than looking at Carmelita Spatz. So the Baudelaires sat down across from them and introduced themselves. "I'm Violet Baudelaire," said Violet Baudelaire, "and this is my brother Claus and our baby sister Sunny." "It's nice to meet you," said the boy. "My name is Duncan Quagmire, and this is my sister Isadora." "And the girl who was yelling at you, I'm sorry to say, was Carmelita Spatz." "She didn't seem very nice," Claus said. "That is an understatement of the century," Isadora said. "Carmelita Spatz is rude, filthy, and violent, and the less time you spend with her, the happier you will be." "Read the Baudelaires the poem you wrote about her," Duncan said to his sister. "You write poetry?" Claus asked. He had read a lot about poets, but had never met one. "Just a little bit," Isadora said modestly. "I write poems down in this notebook. It's an interest of mine." "Sappho!" Sunny shrieked, which meant something like, "I'd be very pleased to hear a poem of yours." Claus explained to the Quagmires what Sunny meant, and Isadora smiled and opened her notebook. "It's a very short poem," she said. "Only 2 rhyming lines." "That's called a couplet," Claus said. "I learned that from a book of literary criticism." "Yes, I know," Isadora said, and then read her poem, leaning forward so Carmelita Spatz would not overhear. "I would rather eat a bowl of vampire bats than spend an hour with Carmelita Spatz." The Baudelaires giggled and then covered their mouths so nobody would know that they were laughing at Carmelita. "That was great," Claus said. "I like the part about the bowls of bats." "Thanks," Isadora said. "I would be interested in reading that book of literary criticism you told me about. Would you let me borrow it?" Claus looked down. "I can't," he said. "That book belonged to my father, and it was destroyed in the fire." The Quagmires looked at one another, and their eyes grew even wider. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Duncan said. "My sister and I have been through a terrible fire, so we know what that's like. Did your father die in the fire?" "Yes, he did," Claus said, "and my mother, too." Isadora put down her fork, reached across the table, and patted Claus on the hand. Normally, this might have embarrassed Claus a little bit, but under the circumstances, it felt perfectly natural. "I'm so sorry to hear that," she said. "Our parents died in the fire as well. It's awful to miss your parents so much, isn't it?" "Blarney," Sunny said, nodding. For a long time, Duncan admitted, I was afraid of any kind of fire. I didn't even like to look at stoves. Violet smiled. We stayed with a woman for a while, our Aunt Josephine, who was afraid of stoves. She was afraid that they might explode. Explode, Duncan said. Even I wasn't afraid of that. Why aren't you staying with your Aunt Josephine now? Now it was Violet's turn to look down, and Duncan's turn to reach across the table and take her hand. She died too, Violet said. Tell you the truth, Duncan, our lives have been very topsy-turvy for quite some time. I'm very sorry to hear it, Duncan said, and I wish I could tell you that things will get better here. But between the Vice Principal Nero playing the violin, Carmelita Spats teasing us, and the dreadful orphan shack, Proof Rock Prep is a pretty miserable place. I think it's awful to call it the orphan shack, Claus said. It's a bad enough place without giving it an insulting nickname. The nickname is more of Carmelita's handwork, I'm sorry to say. Isadora said, Duncan and I had to live there for 3 semesters before we needed a parent or guardian to sign our permission. Because we needed a parent or guardian to sign our permission slip, and we didn't have one. That's the same thing that happened to us, Violet cried. And when we asked Nero to make an exception, he said he was too busy practicing the violin, Isadora said, nodding as she finished Violet's sentence. He always says that. Anyway, Carmelita called it the orphan shack when we were living there, and it looks like she's going to keep on doing it. Well, Violet sighed, Carmelita's nasty names are the least of our problems in the shack. How did you deal with the crabs when you lived there? Duncan let go of her hand to take his notebook out of his pocket. I use my notebook to take notes on things, he explained. I plan to be a newspaper reporter when I get a little bit older, and I figure it's good to start practicing. Here it is, notes on the crabs. They're afraid of loud noises, you see, so I have a list of things we did to scare them away from us. Afraid of loud noises, Violet repeated, and tied her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes. When she ties her hair up like that, Claus explained to the Quagmires, it means she's thinking of an invention. My sister is quite an inventor. How about noisy shoes? Violet said suddenly. If we took small pieces of metal and glued them to our shoes, then wherever we walked would make a loud noise, and I bet we'd hardly ever see those crabs. Noisy shoes, Duncan cried. Isadora and I lived in the orphan shack all that time and never thought of noisy shoes. He took a pencil out of his pocket and wrote Noisy Shoes in the dark green notebook, and then turned the page. I do have a list of fungus books that are in the school library, if you need help with that. Tan stuff on the ceiling. Zap walls, Sunny shrieked. We'd love to see the library, Violet translated. It sure is lucky that we ran into you two twins. Duncan's and Isadora's faces fell, an expression which does not mean that the front part of their heads actually fell to the ground. It simply means that the two siblings suddenly looked very sad. What's wrong? Claus asked. Did we say something that upset you? Twins, Duncan said so softly that the Baudelaires could barely hear him. You are twins, aren't you? Violet asked. You look just alike. We're triplets, Isadora said sadly. I'm confused, Violet said. Aren't triplets 3 people born at the same time? We were 3 people born at the same time, Isadora explained, but our brother Quigley died in the fire that killed our parents. I'm very sorry to hear that, Claus said. Please forgive our calling you twins. We meant no disrespect to Quigley's memory. Of course you didn't, Duncan said, giving the Baudelaires a small smile. There's no way you could have known. Come on, if you're done with your lasagna, we'll show you the library. And maybe we can find some pieces of metal, Isadora said, for noisy shoes. The Baudelaire orphans smiled, and the 5 of them bussed their trays and walked out of the cafeteria. The library turned out to be a very pleasant place, but it was not the comfortable chairs and the huge wooden bookshelves, or the hush of people reading that made the 3 siblings feel so good as they walked into the room. It is useless for me to tell you all about the brass lamps in the shapes of different fish, or the bright blue curtains that rippled like water as a breeze came in from the window, because although these are wonderful things, they are not what made the 3 children smile. The Quagmire triplets were smiling too, and although I have not researched the Quagmires nearly as much as I have the Baudelaires, I can say with reasonable accuracy that they were smiling for the same reason. It is a relief in hectic and frightening times to find true friends, and it was this relief that all 5 children were feeling as the Quagmires gave the Baudelaires a tour of the Proof Rock Library. Friends can make you feel that the world is smaller and less sneaky than it really is, because you know the people who have similar experiences, a phrase which here means having lost family members in terrible fires and lived in the orphan shack. As Duncan and Isidore whispered to Violet, Claus, and Sunny, explaining how the library was organized, the Baudelaire children felt less and less distressed about their new circumstances, and by the time Duncan and Isidora were recommending their favorite books, the three siblings thought that perhaps their troubles were coming to an end at last. They were wrong about this, of course, but for the moment it didn't matter. The Baudelaire orphans had found friends, and as they stood in the library with Quagmire triplets, the world felt smaller and safer than it had for a long, long time. Chapter 4. Here is the picture. Chapter 4. If you have walked into a museum recently, whether you did so to attend an art exhibition or to escape from the police, you may have noticed a type of painting known as a triptych. A triptych has 3 panels, with something different painted on each of the panels. So I think that's what the picture is, a triptych, because there's 3 panels, and there's something different on each one. For instance, my friend Professor Reed made a triptych for me, and he painted fire on one panel, a typewriter on another, and the face of a beautiful, intelligent woman on the third. The triptych is entitled What Happened to Beatrice, and I cannot look upon it without weeping. I am a writer and not a painter, but if I were to try and paint a triptych entitled The Baudelaire Orphans' Miserable Experiences at Prufrock Prep, I would paint Mr. Remora on one panel, Mrs. Bass on another, and a box of staples on the third, and the results would make me so sad that between the Beatrice triptych and the Baudelaire triptych, I would scarcely stop weeping all day. Mr. Remora was Violet's teacher, and he was so terrible that Violet thought she'd almost rather stay in the orphan shack all morning and eat her meals with her hands tied behind her back, rather than hurry to room 1 and learn from such a wretched man. Mr. Remora had a dark and thick mustache, as if somebody had chopped off a gorilla's thumb and stuck it above Mr. Remora's lip. And also like a gorilla, Mr. Remora was constantly eating bananas. Bananas are fairly delicious fruit and contain a healthy amount of potassium, but after watching Mr. Remora shove banana after banana into his mouth, dropping banana peels on the floor, and smearing banana pulp on his chin and in his mustache, Violet never wanted to see another banana again. In between bites of banana, Mr. Remora would tell stories, and the children would write the stories down in notebooks, and every so often there would be a test. The stories were short, and there were a whole lot of them on every conceivable subject. One day I went to the store to purchase a carton of milk, Mr. Remora would say, chewing on a banana. When I got home, I poured the milk into a glass and drank it. Then I watched television. The end. Or, one afternoon, a man named Edward got into a green truck and drove to a farm. The farm had geese and cows. The end. Mr. Remora would tell story after story and eat a banana after banana, and it would get more and more difficult for Violet to pay attention. To make things better, Duncan sat next to Violet, and they would pass notes to one another, particularly on boring days. But to make things worse, Carmelita sat right behind Violet, and every few minutes she would lean forward and poke Violet with a stick she had found on the lawn. "Orphan," she would whisper, and poke Violet with a stick, and Violet would lose her concentration and forget to write down some detail of Mr. Remora's latest story. Across the hall in room 2 was Claus's teacher, Mrs. Bass, whose black hair was so long and messy that she also vaguely resembled a gorilla. Mrs. Bass was a poor teacher, a phrase which here does not mean a teacher who doesn't have a lot of money, but it means a teacher who's obsessed with the metric system. The metric system, you probably know, is a system by which the majority of the world measures things. Just as it is perfectly all right to eat a banana or two, it is perfectly all right to be interested in measuring things. Claus could remember a time when he was about 8 years old, when he had measured the width of all the doorways in the Baudelaire mansion when he was bored one rainy afternoon. But rain or shine, all Mrs. Bass wanted to do was measure things and write down the measurements on the chalkboard. Each morning she would walk into room 2, carrying a bag full of ordinary objects, a frying pan, a picture frame, the skeleton of a cat, and place an object on each student's desk. "Measure," Miss Bass would shout, and everyone would take out their rulers and measure whatever it was that their teacher had put on their desks. They would call out the measurements to Miss Bass, who would write them on the board and then have everybody switch objects. The class would continue on this way for the entire morning, and Claus would feel his eyes glaze over. The phrase glaze over here means ache slightly out of boredom. Across the room, Isadora Quagmire's eyes were glazing over too, and occasionally the two of them would look at one another and stick their tongues out, as if to say, Mrs. Bass is terribly boring, isn't she? But Sunny, instead of going into a classroom, had to work in the administrative building, and I must say that her situation was perhaps the worst in the entire triptych. As Vice Principal Narrow's secretary, Sunny had numerous duties assigned to her that were simply impossible for a baby to perform. For instance, she was in charge of answering the telephone, but people who called Vice Principal Narrow did not always know that Saltepia was Sunny's way of saying, "Good morning, this is Vice Principal Narrow's office, how may I help you?" By the second day, Narrow was furious at her for confusing so many of his business associates. In addition, Sunny was in charge of typing, stapling, and mailing all of Vice Principal Narrow's letters, which meant she had to work a typewriter, a stapler, and stamps, all of which were designed for adult use. Unlike many babies, Sunny had some experience in hard work. After all, she and her siblings had worked for some time at the Lunky Smells lumber mill, but this equipment was simply inappropriate for such tiny fingers. Sunny could scarcely move the typewriter's keys, and even when she could, she did not know how to spell most of the words Narrow dictated. She had never used a stapler before, so she sometimes stapled her fingers by mistake, which hurt quite a bit, and occasionally one of the stamps would stick to her tongue and wouldn't come off. So she had to eat it? Ugh. In most schools, no matter how miserable the students, have a chance to recuperate during the weekend, when they can rest and play instead of attending wretched classes, and the Baudelaire orphans look forward to taking a break from looking at bananas, rulers, and secretarial supplies. So they were quite distressed one Friday when the Quagmires informed them that prep did not have weekends. Saturday and Sunday were regular school days, supposedly in keeping the school's motto. The world did not really make sense. It is, after all, just as easy to remember you will die when you are relaxing as when you are in school. But that was the way things were, so the Baudelaires could never remember exactly what day it was. So repetitive was their schedule. So I am sorry to say I cannot tell you what day it was when Sunny noticed that the staple supply was running low. But I can tell you that Narrow informed her that because she had wasted so much time learning to be a secretary, he would not buy any more when she ran out. Instead, Sunny had to make staples herself out of some skinny metal rods Narrow kept in a drawer. "That's ridiculous," Violet cried when Sunny told her of Narrow's latest demand. It was after dinner, and the Baudelaire orphans were in the orphan shack with the Quagmire triplets, sprinkling salt at the ceilings. Violet had found some pieces of metal behind the cafeteria and had fashioned 5 pairs of noisy shoes, 3 for the Baudelaires and 2 for the Quagmires, so the crabs wouldn't bother them when they visited the orphan shack. The problem of the tan fungus, however, was yet to be solved. With Duncan's help, Claus had found a book on the fungus in the library and had read that salt might make this particular fungus shrivel up. The Quagmires had distracted some of the masked cafeteria workers by dropping their trays on the ground, and while Narrow yelled at them for making a mess, the Baudelaires had slipped 3 salt shakers into their pockets. Now, in the brief recess after dinner, the 5 children were sitting on bales of hay, trying to toss salt onto the fungus and talking about their day. "It certainly is ridiculous," Claus agreed. "It's silly enough that Sunny has to be a secretary, but making her own staples, I've never heard of anything so unfair." "I think staples are made in factories," Duncan said, pausing to flip through his green notebook to see if he had any notes on the matter. "I don't think people have made staples by hand since the 15th century. "If you could snitch some of the skinny metal rods, Sunny," Isadora said, "we could all help you make the staples after dinner time. If 5 of us worked together, it would be much less trouble. And speaking of trouble, I'm working on a poem about Count Olaf, but I'm not sure I know words that are terrible enough to describe him." "I imagine it's difficult to find words that rhyme with Olaf," Violet said. "It is difficult," Isadora admitted. "All I can think of so far is pilaf, which is a kind of rice dish, and that's more a half rhyme anyway. Maybe someday you'll be able to publish your poem about Count Olaf, Klaus said, and everyone will know how horrible he is, and I'll write a newspaper article about it, Duncan volunteered. I think I could build a printing press myself, Violet said. Maybe when I come of age, I can use some of the Baudelaire fortune to buy the materials I would need. Could we print books, too? Claus asked. Violet smiled. She knew her brother was thinking of a whole library they could print for themselves. Books, too, she said. The Baudelaire fortune? Duncan asked. Did your parents leave behind a fortune, too? Our parents owned the famous Quagmire sapphires, which were unharmed in the fire. When we come of age, those precious jewels will belong to us. We can start our own printing business together. That's a wonderful idea, Violet cried. We could call it the Quagmire Baudelaire Incorporated. We could call it the Quagmire Baudelaire Incorporated. The children were so surprised to hear the sneering voice of Vice Principal Narrow that they dropped their salt shakers on the ground. Instantly, the tiny crabs in the orphan shack picked them up and scurried away with them before Narrow could notice. I'm sorry to interrupt you in the middle of your important business meeting, he said, although the youngsters could see that the vice principal wasn't sorry one bit. The new gym teacher has arrived, and he was interested in meeting our orphan population before my concert began. Apparently, orphans have excellent bone structure or something. Isn't that what you said, Coach Genghis? Oh, yes, said a tall, skinny man, who stepped forward to reveal himself to the children. The man was wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt, such as any gym teacher might wear. On his feet were some expensive-looking running shoes with very high tops, and around his neck was a shiny silver whistle. Wrapped around the top of his head was a length of cloth secured in place by a shiny red jewel. Such things were called turbans and worn by some people for religious reasons, but Violet, Claus, and Sunny took one look at this man and knew that he was wearing a turban for an entirely different reason. Oh, yes, said the man again. All orphans have perfect legs for running, and I couldn't wait to see what specimens were waiting for me here in the shack. Children, Narrow said, get up off your hay and say hello to Coach Genghis. Hello, Coach Genghis, Duncan said. Hello, Coach Genghis, Isadora said. The Quagmire triplets each shook Coach Genghis Boney's hand, and then turned and gave the Baudelaires a confused look. They were clearly surprised to see three siblings still sitting on the hay and staring up at the coach, rather than obeying Narrow's orders. But had I been there in the orphan shack, I most certainly would not have been surprised, and I would bet what happened to Beatrice, my prize triptych, that had you been there, you would not have been surprised either. Because you probably guessed the Baudelaires guessed. I'm having a hard time today. Why, the man who was calling himself Coach Genghis was wearing a turban. A turban covers people's hair, which can alter their appearance quite a bit. And if the turban is arranged so that it hangs down rather low, as this one did, the folds of the cloth can even cover the eyebrows, or encase eyebrow of the person wearing it. But it cannot cover someone's shiny, shiny eyes, or the greedy and sinister look that somebody might have in their eyes when the person looks down at three relatively helpless children. What the man who called himself Coach Genghis had said about all orphans having perfect legs for running was utter nonsense, of course, but as the Baudelaires looked up at their new gym teacher, they wished that it weren't nonsense. As the man who called himself Coach Genghis looked back at them with his shiny, shiny eyes, the Baudelaire orphans wished more than anything that their leg could carry them far, far away from the man who was really Count Olaf. Chapter 5 for next time.